Hello people, this is Srikanth here and we are here today to talk about the audio interface. The audio interface is also called the sound card, the analog to digital converter and many other things in different contexts. And regardless of how scaled up or not our setups are, we'll still need to use a sound card to get sound from our computers to get to the speakers and the headphones through which we monitor the sounds, and on the other hand to bring signals from instruments and microphones onto the recording software to be able to record and process it as well. Amongst all the different names, an analog to digital converter probably is the most appropriate one, because primarily that's what an audio interface does, because all the signals that we bring from microphones and instruments are rather analog electrical signals and the computer does not understand that, so everything has to be converted to their own binary digital equivalents, and that's what the sound card does. But for convenience's sake, sound cards these days also ship with pre-amplifiers and power amplifiers and a bunch of other features installed within themselves, so that we don't need to run around looking for other things to incorporate within the signal chain to achieve these smaller things. There are many brands and many different variants out there of sound cards. To keep things simpler, we'll stick to two sound cards that are made by this company called the Focusrite. We'll look at the Scarlett Solo, which allows for one microphone to be recorded and alongside for one instrument or line signal to be recorded, which in simple words is one guitar or a keyboard or however you would like to use it. And the flagship one would allow up to 8 inputs and then will allow you to expand using ADAT, and all these different terminologies is what we are trying to understand today. Okay, the first thing we've got to look at is called the pre-amplifier. Like the name suggests, amplifier amplifies sound. Amplification can also be related to loudness or volume. So things that are inherently coming out of a microphone, the signals that we receive from a microphone or a guitar for that matter as well, are feeble signals and they need to be added amplification to for it to become useful. Pre-amplifiers come with a knob which we call the gain knob. The gain stands for how much volume gain can be achieved using the pre-amplifier. Also these days audio interfaces incorporate features like auto gain and clip protection and stuff like that, because of which you wouldn't need to keep monitoring all the time as to if the sound is clipping or not, because the machine does it automatically anyway. Pre-amplifiers can come in different forms. More often than not, it is in the form of an XLR connector. XLR is a type of a cable that we use to connect microphones to our sound cards. But outside of the XLR connector, there also is a 1/4-inch connector, let's say the guitar cable that we conventionally use. An XLR connector would expect for you to connect an XLR cable to it, more often than not coming from a microphone. And instrument level signals are coming out of guitars and keyboards and synthesizers and drum machines and so on and so forth. Right next to the preamp, you see this control named 48V. 48V stands for 48 volts worth of an electrical current, which is designed specifically to be sent back to this one variety of microphones called the condenser microphone, because condenser microphone has a little amplifier within the mic capsule itself. So for signals to be brought to normalized levels within the microphone, this phantom power or 48 volts worth of an electrical current needs to be sent back to the microphone. On the other hand, dynamic microphones like SM58, SM57, none of these will require phantom, but on the other hand will require for a lot more gain than a condenser microphone. Next to that, you'll usually find this parameter named INST, which stands for an instrument level signal. Like we were speaking before, mic level signals, instrument level signals, and line level signals are the three varieties that we very commonly deal with within the studio. Mic level signals are way more feeble than the other two, so a lot more gain and phantom power and all of that needs to be used. And then there are line level signals which are fully normalized, coming out of devices like synthesizers and keyboards and drum machines and many other things, which essentially means volume has been already normalized within the instrument itself. And then an instrument level signal sits right in between these two, which is not as feeble as the mic level signal, nor as normalized as the line level signal. So not too much gain, but not no gain at all. So in between, we would need to find an average to have the instrument level signals be normalized so that they become useful as well. So this function, INST, will allow you to enable the instrument level signal to be received by the preamp, which essentially means when you switch it on, the preamp or the connector to which you're plugging the cable into knows that you are bringing in an instrument level signal and it has to treat it accordingly. Direct monitoring is a very, very interesting concept because now we have got to think about this problem called latency. Latency has to do with analog to digital conversion taking its own time, and that time causing trouble to us. Many times when you play a note on an instrument and then you hear the corresponding sound of that note a couple of seconds later is going to be very problematic, and that latency depends on many different kinds of parameters, out of which direct monitoring is one solution to this problem. Direct monitoring allows you to route signals that are connected to these preamps directly from there to the outputs and then to the speakers, so that you hear them without them going and passing through the computer and the digital audio workstation and getting converted from analog to digital and then back from digital to analog and so on and so forth. Because this entire process, as we mentioned and spoke about it now, takes its own kind of time. Power amplifier is another amplifier in the signal chain that comes afterwards, and hence the prefix power or post amplifier. And post amplifier also has a gain knob to itself like a preamplifier, just that this gain knob is more often than not referred to as the master volume knob because it controls the loudness of what signal is being sent from the interface to the speaker or the headphones. The speaker outputs and the headphone outputs can be separated. Sometimes they are separated if these are flagship interfaces that we are talking about, or sometimes they are combined and they mirror each other in cases such as the Scarlett Solo, which is a beginner version of the Scarlett interface lineup. The power amplifiers essentially send signals out from the interface to the speakers, and without the power amplifier and the power amplifier outputs, there is no means for us to monitor the sounds that are coming back from our computer, and also anything that is directly monitored from the preamplifier through the power amplifier and the speakers. So all the functions that we have spoken about until now, you will mostly find on all the interfaces, regardless of how small or big or entry or flagship it is. And the ones that we are going to speak going forward from now is mostly found on more elaborate interfaces, because these functions will enable these interfaces to fit right into bigger setups where there are multiple instruments and multiple things to be recorded at the same time and multiple kinds of signals to be sent from one place to another: microphone, line, instrument, MIDI, SPDIF, so on and so forth. So amongst the ones that are uncommon in entry-level interfaces is this thing called the SPDIF or the SPDIF inputs and the outputs. These are useful in the context of more unbalanced and commercially driven pieces of equipment like vinyl player or a turntable or a CD or a DVD player or a television, so on and so forth. So to bring these kinds of signals from devices like these onto the interface, SPDIF can be very useful. More often than not, you will find one input and one output in the SPDIF format in more elaborate interfaces. Like I said, can be found used for in different cases based on what your setup is. The next would be the MIDI inputs and the outputs. MIDI is a digital language that enables us to communicate with the computer musically, and it incorporates different kinds of messages like the note message, the control change message, the program change message, using which you are able to play notes, using which you are able to push faders up and down and change parameters, turn knobs back and forth and change parameters, and so on and so forth. MIDI is an interesting world because MIDI in the recent times is being transferred using USB cables, which brings in many more advantages than we can think of, because USB is bidirectional, which essentially means both the input and the output can happen with one single USB cable. Of course, without having to mention, each interface would have some means to connect it to the computer. So these days it is the C-type connector. Previously it used to be the type B USB connector. But then older MIDI protocols that used 5-pin DIN MIDI cables would require a separate input and an output. Most flagship synthesizers will also include one MIDI input and one MIDI output in the form of 5-pin DIN connectors. That comes in use when you have to daisy chain MIDI signals from one keyboard to another. Mostly setups where there are a lot of analog keyboards and drum machines and so on and so forth, where you have to pass, most importantly, the clock messages from one device to another so that the tempo is synced, playback is synced, and then sometimes also note and control change and program change messages. Another very, very important and an interesting concept is the ADAT expansion. ADAT allows for 8 channels worth of audio signals to be carried using one single cable. ADAT uses this optical cable which uses a beam of light to transfer signal and data from one place to another. One of the interfaces that we have been looking at all this while is this flagship Focusrite interface from the Scarlett lineup, which is called the 18i20. And as the name suggests, you would assume an 18i20 interface would allow for 18 inputs and 20 outputs to be used with one device, which is not the case, which is why ADAT happens to be such an interesting concept, because when interfaces are named 18i20, it essentially means it's expandable up to having 18 inputs and 20 outputs. But if you look at the hardware panel, you will only find about 8 analog preamps, meaning 8 inputs. Sure, you can add a SPDIF input and a MIDI input to that lineup, but when you say 18 inputs, you expect for there to be 18 analog preamps through which you can connect signals and convert them and bring it to the computer, record, process, etc., etc. ADAT is the protocol using which this expansion is possible. 18i20 essentially means you buy an interface which has 8 preamps on it, and then another expansion unit with another 8 preamps on it, and then run an ADAT cable between that and this to cascade those 8 inputs from the expansion onto the interface that you are connecting the USB cable from to the computer. There are more details to pay attention to in the context of ADAT, because sometimes you'll also find a pair of ADAT inputs and outputs. That does not mean instead of 8, now you can cascade 16 inputs or outputs in majority of the cases, because a pair of inputs is only useful when you are using a higher sample rate. Sample rate is another thing. It can be boiled down to, let's say, the resolution of audio. I would encourage for you to find out more about what sample rate is from the internet, because it is more than just the resolution. But depending on what sample rate you are using to convert signals from analog to digital, if it is below a certain threshold, then you would only require one ADAT connection to be made. If it is beyond a certain sample rate threshold, then you would need to split those 8 signals into groups of 4 and then use 2 ADAT cables to cascade 8 preamps or 8 inputs from an expansion unit onto the interface, the primary interface that you're using in your setup. The last thing I would want to talk about is this thing called the word clock. Word clock, unlike MIDI, is an analog way to send clock signals from one place to another. It's relevant here because most interfaces, mostly the flagship ones, will also have their own internal clock. As musicians, as users of digital audio workstations, we understand how important tempo, time, grid, all of these things are, and somebody needs to generate a clock signal and keep everybody synced to that clock signal. Many times your digital audio workstation plays that role, but if you choose to use the internal clock within the audio interface as the primary clock, then word clock output will allow you to sync all the devices in your studio to the internal clock of the audio interface. Outside of this, there is power supply and VU meters and stuff like that. VU meter is a visual reference as to how loud a certain signal is or not. It's color coded, because of which it's easier to find out if something is clipping or not, so on and so forth. But these are all utilities more than primary functions. All these things put together make an audio interface. Like we spoke before, these can come in different shapes and sizes, and some of these are quite affordable, and some of these will still do exactly what the affordable ones do, claiming that they do it better and then will cost at least 4 times more. That discrepancy between what is so expensive and what is so affordable has to do with other features that we have not spoken about today. For example, Universal Audio is one of those brands that make interfaces which has inbuilt signal processing. So as much as your computer takes care of processing by giving it power from the RAM and the SSD, as much the interface also does from its end, so that latency and things like these can be minimized as much as it can be. And I hope this has been useful and will contribute in some way to your decision as to what should be useful to you or not in your context. Have a great time making music, guys. Cheers.